Well, the first episode is going to be on slavery reparations and Confederate heritage and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So I'm going to show you this book called Punished with Poverty. It's by James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy. It's published by Shotwell Publishing and has a couple guns crossed over here. And you can get these books on Amazon. They publish other books. Let me just show you a couple. One is they sell as Snowflake Buddies. I think this is really clever. Another book is by Kirkpatrick Sale. Yes, that's the smallest beautiful guy. He's gone into the neo-Confederate movement. It's called Emancipation Hell, the Tragedy Wrought by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. See, you can't see it here, but Lincoln has little horns on. He's a devil, and there's these drawings of these flames, because this is like Emancipation Hell. So that's another book they sell. If you look at it, you'll find quite a few interesting books. So that's who publishes this book. They've done actually a whole series. And what this book advocates, let me just show it again, is that the South needs to be paid for its slaves that Lincoln emancipated, because they weren't paid for it during the time of emancipation. So these two authors, James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy, there's an article about them in Chronicles magazine. This is published by the Rockford Institute in Rockford, Illinois. It's now part of the Charlemagne Institute. And one of the brothers was a member of the League of the South, and so the president of the League of the South, Michael Hill, did an article on them. This is the December 1996 Chronicles magazine. And just give me a second. There's an article on the good Kennedys in here. And what makes these Kennedys good is, to Michael Hill that is that they were a staunch opponent of the Civil Rights Movement from way back. They actually rolled with Ross as teenagers. As teenagers, Ross Barnett was a candidate against civil rights, and he was the head of a movement against civil rights. They were supportive of him. Later on, they were supportive of George Wallace, who was a presidential candidate who ran against civil rights as a core part of his campaign in running for president back in 1968. So these guys go way, way back, and the article explains why their book, The South Was Right, one of the foundation books of the neo-Confederate movement, was written in response to the civil rights movement. So these are who they are. They're longtime opponents of civil rights going way back. So, there's a couple of these guys out there, Kennedy brothers. Actually, they're twins. And you might say, well, okay, so they wrote a crazy book. What does this have to do with the Sons of Confederate Veterans? Why does this reflect on the neo-Confederate movement in general? Walter Donald Kennedy is the chief of heritage operations for the Sons of Confederate Veterans starting in the fall of 2018. He appointed his brother, James Ronald Kennedy, as the deputy head of Confederate heritage operations. So these are the guys defending Confederate heritage for the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And so they're not just anyone out there. I think we can look at their ideology, and since they are appointed to be the defenders of Confederate heritage, we can see what this heritage is all about. By the way, they have a website. It'll be in the description for this video. It's called thekennedytwins.com, and you can see some of the other books, which are quite something else. The appointment, Walter Donald Kennedy, be the chief of heritage operations, was announced in the Confederate Veteran issue of September-October 2018. If you go to the page, it's in here. There's a Commander-in-Chief section. It's a report of the Commander-in-Chief. And the Commander-in-Chief is Paul C. Gramling Jr. And he's announcing his Southern Victory campaign. They're hoping to basically get all the Confederate monuments back up and prevent any further Confederate monuments from being taken down. And in this, he announces, I've appointed Donnie Kennedy, co-author of The South Was Right, as my Chief of Heritage Operations. I'm working on a long-term plan with Donnie, the Southern Victory Campaign, in which we, the purveyors of truth, will control the narrative. And so they know who Donnie Kennedy is, or Donald Kennedy is. They know he's the co-author of The South Was Right. And they're mentioning that so that the readership says, oh, he's, they know who this book, because this is one of the major books founding the modern neo-Confederate movement. So they mention that he's the co-author, they'll know who he is. So it's not like Walter Donald Kennedy pulled something on them, or they didn't really know who he was, or I don't know, there'll be some excuse drawn up by the Confederates. But they know who this guy is, they know, and they're selling him as being a good chief of heritage on the basis that he did write this book. And this is the official publication, the Confederate Veteran. It's the official publication of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So if you go to the Kennedy Twin website, you can see some pretty interesting books. And when I say interesting, I mean sort of appalling and weird, notably bad. Excuse me. So this is one book they're selling. It's called Re-Killing Lincoln. Basically, they want to assassinate his character. They don't exactly say it that way, but they want to kill his reputation. They sort of explain where the title comes from. Re-Killing Lincoln. And then another one was Jefferson Davis Bright. They have a question mark on the end of this, but I can tell you their view is that Jefferson Davis was right. There's an interesting section where they condemn the American Pledge of Allegiance. It's not a leftist viewpoint of it. They actually see the Pledge of Allegiance part of its socialist conspiracy. This is another book. Walter Donald Kennedy wrote in conjunction with Al Benson Jr. This is the idea that there was a Marxist conspiracy in the Lincoln administration. It's titled Lincoln's Marxist, and it's a very interesting type of reasoning. I'm going to probably go into that at some other point, but they sort of see the Republicans being involved with communism from the very beginning, or the communists being involved in sort of inside the Republican Party back in the 1860s. This is the book. This is one of the two books which helped found the modern neo-Confederate movement, and it's by James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy. The neo-Confederates want to recommend something the Kennedy brothers have done. They refer to this book. 120-some thousand plus copies were sold, as I said earlier. And this book is very highly regarded amongst neo-Confederates. So neo-Confederate leaders want to recommend the Kennedy brothers, or a book reviewer wants to recommend the Kennedy brothers, or someone wants to give credibility to the Kennedy brothers in terms of whatever they're communicating to other neo-Confederates. They refer to this book. This book is held in very high esteem in the neo-Confederate movement. So I think that since this book is referred to in the book reviews for Punished with Poverty and in the recommendations for the book for Punished with Poverty, I think we ought to know what this book says. So I'm going to just pick a couple items here. One is they advocate qualifications for voting. First qualification is to pass a test on reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I think we know the past history of those types of tests being used to arbitrarily exclude people. Also, maybe one of the big problems in your district, in your area, is that they need to have a better educational system. And the people most victimized by it would be least able to pass that test. Second qualification for voting is that you be a taxpayer. Now, they specifically rule out the sales tax and also any taxes deducted from your paycheck, such as the federal income tax. You would not qualify to vote because you paid that tax as a deduction. It has to be something where you make a direct payment. So I suppose if you owned your house and you make property taxes, you qualify. If you're a renter, that's a good question how you would qualify. You probably would have to go down and pay some type of fee. And so I think that though they do not mention the word poll tax, it's hard to see how a lot of people would become voters without paying a poll tax. Third qualification is that anyone who gets any form of relief from the federal government is not eligible to vote. So if you had a student loan, and he doesn't mention it specifically, but you're probably not qualified to vote. If you're going to the Veteran Administration hospital, you probably don't qualify to vote. Anyone on Social Security, getting any federal medical help, that you don't qualify to vote. You start seeing that actually this mostly excludes poor people. Now they'll say it's not racist, and to some extent, or in some ways of interpretation, it's not. It's anti-poor, but since African Americans in this country are disproportionately less well off, it would have a tremendous impact on African Americans. People who bankrupt, would be the fourth qualification of voting, is that people who have declared bankruptcy can't vote. And of course, I don't know, people borrow money and they go into debt to do technological startups and things like that. I don't think we want to basically penalize those who take risks in our economy, the right to vote. So that's the thing. And here let me have a concluding section to this. And this should tell you sort of where they come from. Let me read it. It's a concluding paragraph. Some will protest that we are repealing the Voting Rights Act. This is not true. You do not repeal a fraud. You correct it. You do not recall a tyrant. You remove him. The same is true with the so-called Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, as with all other Reconstruction legislation, see Chapter 6, must be annulled to restore the balance between the federal and state governments. So they see the Voting Rights Act as a big fraud and it's something that needs to be abolished. And without the Voting Rights Act, you can imagine what might happen in many districts of this country in terms of people's ability to vote. Voter repression or suppression would really take off. I'll take up another topic they have, the appendix, and they have a section. They basically are against the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is what gave citizenship to African Americans. And so they have an article from U.S. News and World Report against it. And then they have an article from something called the Georgia Journal of Southern Legal History from the spring-summer 1991 issue. And it's written by Forrest McDonald, who was a neo-Confederate. He's dead now. So they're out and gunning for the 14th Amendment, the very amendment that grants citizenship to African Americans. So this is what type of book it is. So when you read some neo-Confederate mentioning that they're the Kennedy brothers are authors of this book, as a means of recommending the Kennedy brothers, you know where that person's coming from, and you know what the views of his intended audience are for people who are dead set against civil rights. Another book that they sell at their site is The Myths of American Slavery. and this is a book which is basically a defense of American slavery in many ways. I would call it apologetic, but that's a more technical term. They're not apologizing for slavery. What they're doing is making excuses for it. And we'll get back to that. And this is a merchandise catalog. It's a merchandise catalog for 2016, 2017. I've been doing a lot of reporting on my blog and elsewhere about what the Sons of Confederate Veterans are selling, what type of stuff they're pushing in their merchandise catalog. So their latest one has a lot of stuff missing, but this one's fairly typical of what it has been. And what you can see is there's a whole series of stuff that they're of Kennedy twin material that they sell. There's the myths of American slavery. There's so another page. Oh, here. There's Lincoln's Marxists. Here they're selling The South Was Right, and I think that's what they're selling in this thing. But this catalog has been selling their books. And this is the merchandise catalog of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So let me put that back here. I'm going to get back to it. So there's been ads for this Punished with Poverty has been advertised in the Confederate Veteran, official publication of the Sons of Confederate Veteran. Here's 2 issues where it's appeared. Excuse me a second. One is November, December 2016. And it's the inside cover ad. So you can see it's the inside cover. And there it is. Nearly a full page ad. And then, of course, there's an ad for Re-Killing Lincoln. And there's an ad for The South Was Right. So it's been known, this book is known to the SCV membership and the leadership. Here's another issue that had an ad for it. It's March, April 2017. And here's the ad. The same ad. It's a full page ad. And about 2/3 of it's for Punished with Poverty. There's Re-Killing Lincoln, and there's The South Was Right. So, again, the existence of this book has been known to the membership and certainly to the leadership of the SCV. So I want to read some extracts from this book, Punished with Poverty, to give you an idea of what the authors say in this book and what their viewpoint is. So the first part is the authors portray the sort of benign image of Southern slavery, where masters and slaves are maybe not exactly friends, but they're on some type of positive relationship. The system of slavery was benign. And also they very strenuously reject the idea that slavery might be negative or harsh or brutal. So let me read some extracts from here. Here's one extract. Southern historian Francis B. Simpkins also noted the close relationship that existed among Black and white Southerners during the antebellum era. Social intimacy between the children of the 2 races was unimpaired by race consciousness. Simpkins continues his discussion of the close relationship between Black and white children, noting that as they grew and matured, a unique relationship was formed. With adulthood, race consciousness became definite, but the genuine Southerner felt no physical repulsion from colored people. The warm bond of friendship established by the sharing of each other's life and space was noted by William Faulkner, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949, a racist author if there ever was one. Faulkner asserts that the slaveholder and slave in the antebellum South were only superficially different from each other. They both shared a common lifestyle. So after painting this warm picture, he wants to denounce views of antebellum slavery as views which see antebellum slavery as a terrible thing. Standard politically correct history informs a gullible public that slavery down south was harsh to the point of early death, hunger, sickness, rape, and torture. This disgustingly harsh life is said to be the common lot of the wretched slaves in the Old South. Yet, as many investigators have pointed out, there is more to the story of slavery down south than the well-hyped propaganda miniseries such as Roots or the fictional Uncle Tom's Cabin. So here's another thing. Early 20th century author commentary on slavery, contrasting antebellum Southern slavery with Caribbean slavery. When comparing the lives of slaves introduced to the Caribbean large plantations and the smaller Southern plantation, U.B. Phillips noted that the slaves fared much better in the Old South because they were introduced into a small rather than a large plantation system. This small plantation system offered better food and surely better care by reason of the domestic tone of the regime, in contrast with the absentee commercialism of the islands. By introducing the new slaves into a small plantation system where he lived alongside his slaves and treated them as his extended family, the master was rewarded with healthy workers and the slave was spared high mortality and morbidity rates so common in the Caribbean. Well, it's true. Slaves died. They died quickly in the Caribbean. They were death camps. The reason it was different in the Old South was there was a prohibition on importing slaves. So you couldn't work a slave to death in 7 or 8 years and still expect to have me go down and buy more slaves. But also, even so, it wasn't all that good. I was reading by Cooper a biography of Jefferson Davis, and one of the things he pointed out was Jefferson Davis was fond of this old slave. And he said one of the reasons probably is that he was one of the few slaves in his 40s on his plantation. And this guy bought most of his slaves as teenagers, and he had few left in the 40s. Now Cooper makes an excuse for it, which is appalling and ought to have him he should be drummed out of the profession. I'm not going to go into that, but they were bought as teenagers, and there's just 1 or 2 making it to their 40s. That's Southern slavery. Now, was it the same everywhere? No, but it was hardly, it looked maybe good versus death camps, but that's about it. And then after Reconstruction, he wants to sort of portray the fact that there's a benign relationship between blacks and whites, and they didn't resent slavery. And so he says, honestly, they just did not understand the South as well as modern liberals do. General Carl Schurz, a radical socialist, Yankee general, discovered in 1865 that even after centuries of enslavement by whites, the former slaves did not hate white people, their former masters. Once again, it must be pointed out that the slaves may not have liked slavery, but they did not hate white Southerners. Well, again, he's gathering together all his, selectively gathering together his facts to portray sort of this benign antebellum slavery. So, I'm going through that so to give you an idea of the mental framework which these 2 authors use to they frame their proposal for reparations for Southern slave owners who lost their slaves. And it's a chapter this is chapter 8, Poverty Imposed by Radical Abolition. It's chapter 8. And in this chapter, they assert their belief that poverty in the South originated with radical abolition. That is to say, that slaves were freed and the slave owners weren't paid. I'm going to read some sections. the manner in which the North forced emancipation upon the South is one of the factors in the loss of Southern investment capital. The problem with stating this fact is that it's immediately met with an emotional response aimed at intimidating the fact finder into silence. It amounts to a declaration by the federal empire propagandists and sycophants that the pro-South fact speaker is merely a racist trying to justify African-American slavery. So if you find this whole idea appalling, it's because you're emotional, not that maybe it's just a lunatic opinion, you know, maybe that you might have an emotional response. It's just like, you know, oh my God, you know, it's sort of astounding. I'll say that. But then also, if you sort of think it's a stupid assertion, there's name calling here, federal empire propagandists and sycophants. It's because you're a propagandist, not that you just think this whole assertion by the authors is just plain stupid. And then what's really rich or hypocritical here is this. He's a complaint that the pro-South fact speaker is merely a racist trying to justify African-American slavery. These are the guys, these authors rolled with Ross, as I explained. They campaigned for a segregationist to become governor of Mississippi. They later on campaigned for segregationist George Wallace. And their major book, the book that made their reputation, the book which is referred to every time someone wants to talk about them, is The South Was Right. And that book was written in response against the civil rights movement. But they have umbrage here that someone might think they're racist. So another section, they estimate that the $2 billion worth of investment capital would be worth $28 billion in 2015 dollars. So that's the estimate of the loss. They see $28 billion, and they're going to use that later. It'll be part of their figure for reparations. And so they go in, they describe the fact that when the British Empire abolished slavery, the slave owners got paid. And when they abolished during the Civil War, the slave owners, during the Civil War, they abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and those slave owners were paid. And thus, they feel that the South is unfairly treated. The United States had compensated Southern slave owners for the approximately 4.5 million slaves in the South at the same rate that they compensated the owners in Washington, $300 per slave. It would have provided approximately $1,350 million that could have been used to restart the Southern economy. One of the primary reasons for the post-war poverty in occupied Dixie was the lack of investment capital. So the basic idea here is if I pay one kidnapper a ransom, I'm obligated to pay all kidnappers a ransom. You know, various ways they've abolished slavery. Sometimes they have used compensation, and mostly it's been driven by a variety of political forces, which people trying to abolish slavery have to negotiate. So as a practical matter, they have paid to abolish compensation. But that doesn't mean the slave owner is due that. Slavery is a crime. They ought to be glad they didn't get sent to jail, or worse. The other question you might have is, does it occur to them in this book that the slaves themselves, African-American slaves, deserve some type of compensation? Maybe they could have been given some money. Maybe they could have jump-started the economy. Absolutely not. It does not occur. The idea that the people who are exploited by slavery may be due funds is just not in their wildest imagination. Or I would say it is in their wild imagination, which is pretty wild. They do not mention it here though. Here's a little aside, by the way. they see this whole non-compensating the South as some type of conspiracy. And they also mentioned that the 14th and 15th Amendments were illegally enacted. And they also see a conspiracy, a genocidal conspiracy against the South. Beginning in the early 1830s, radical Yankee abolitionists began to advance the idea of a Haiti-style slave insurrection down south. Their hope was not merely the removal of slavery, but the extermination of all Southerners who they believed had been polluted by the sin of slavery. So they go on and on here. So it's pretty wild, actually. So anyways, that's their reasoning why the slave owners deserve to be compensated. Because other slave owners had to be paid, and so they figure every slave owner deserves to be paid. A little side thing. That's Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina. And, she supported taking down the Confederate flag off the state grounds. So let me read this caption. Nikki Haley, Scalloway governor of South Carolina, whose actions initiated the current round of slanderous anti-South cultural genocide. Nikki Haley proudly displays her pagan heritage, but viciously attacks Southerners who bravely defend their Southern heritage. Like most Republicans, her desire to climb the national GOP political corporate ladder is more important than honor. So she's not Hindu, she's pagan. They can't bring themselves to say she's Hindu. And also, Hinduism is sort of positioned as being not Southern. And then, note this inflammatory rhetoric. The current round of slanderous anti-South cultural genocide. That means you take down a couple, some monuments and maybe some flags. It's cultural genocide. This is a seething rage, the language of seething rage of the neo-Confederate movement. They're really angry. So, having justified an earlier chapter about how they're going to get slavery reparations, they have chapter 14, reparations for Southern slavery, abolishing Southern poverty, which is about what they're going to do with the money when they get it. And they speak against doing a windfall, or writing checks to descendants of slave owners, because they don't see that as abolishing Southern poverty. So they advocate a program for corporations located in the South to get some type of tax break if they locate there, and big reduction in their corporate taxes. And then these corporations have to have a majority of Southern board members. And they also, there's a sentence here, Southern workers would be given priority over foreign job applicants, and for industry, the majority of the manufacturing would be done in the South, utilizing as much as economically feasible Southern resources. So they say foreign workers versus Southern workers. Defining Southern workers as those born in the South. I would say, what does that mean in terms of like other Americans who happen to move to the South? And what about them? Are they foreign-born applicants? They're not Southerners, and there's only two categories given here. The other thing you need to remember is like people like Einstein and Fermi, and a great many scientists who have contributed to American life were foreign-born. But with this plan, they would not be given preference or priority in hiring by a Southern corporation under this type of plan. Someone with the same type of level of talents would be discriminated against. So that's their plan to use the money. That's how they're going to use the money. And then they don't see this as actually working unless what they call another action to support what they see as a valid form of reparations. And that's the institution of a reactionary system in the South. And they have a plan to do that. So there's a section here, the concurrent government hates traditional Southern values. Let me read the opening sentence. The federal empire's recent attack on traditional Christian values, such as the definition of marriage and the enforcement of gender-neutral rules, should convince black and white Southerners the South and the federal empire are two different peoples and should therefore be two different nations. So this reparations needs to be done within a separate nation. I guess the federal government writes a check and then they secede. I'm not quite sure if I understand this entirely correctly, but that's what they're talking about, two different nations. They also explain in another section, the preceding data should call to mind the biblical warnings to Christians in 2 Corinthians 6:14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. We, the people of the South, are yoked together with radical leftists, secular humanists, who are waging aggressive war against Christian values that Southerners hold dear. So this secession idea, this argument for secession is primarily theological. And it shows that Southern nationalism, as advocated or defined by these people, these authors, is a reaction against modern American life. It's very much for a reactionary system that's long since passed. And they see that for the reparations to be successful, this need for secession, or some means actually, probably they might advocate to have this sort of reactionary pre-modern South. And they go on, more angry language. The South, with its traditional Christian values, its honored Confederate heritage, and its love of limited government, is detested by the federal empire's radical leftist ruling elite. This hatred of the Southern people and their values is also shared by the radical leftists who now control or have dominant influence in education, Hollywood, and the media. One is much more likely to find a supporter of same-sex marriage in the mainline media, educational system, Hollywood, donor class, the ruling elite, than an open believer in traditional Christian values. So the neo-Confederacy isn't about, brass buttons that Robert E. Lee wore. Neo-Confederacy continues to be an ideology that deals with current issues. But because of these things, gay marriage in particular, they think there needs to be two nations. Well, they also go and they have a section of liberty-based society, key to effective reparations. So those reparations not only need to be in a society that has a reactionary set of beliefs, but also needs to have sort of a reactionary economic system. And so you may say, well, that's all very good, Ed, Well, it's not good, but I use a lot of idioms in my language. So, yeah, they say all these things. How do they expect actually to do this? And there's a section. How to enforce the South claim for reparations. So, the first thing they want to explain, I'll read this section. First thing is to make sure the Southern people understand they cannot win by playing business as usual politics. Business as usual politics is a chosen game of the ruling elite. They wrote the rules and the judges are the referees of the game. There is no way the South can win playing their game. This is explained in Nullification, Why and How. This is a book they offer on their website. They suggest that it's a plan to engage in political irregular warfare by doing an end run around the political establishment. It would not be a campaign to elect good conservatives. So what they suggest is having plebiscites or referendums in the South for a constitutional amendment, acknowledging the right of a state to have nullification and the right of a state to secede. And they say, once a people in bondage no longer accept their rulers as being legitimate, then they are already free. All that remains is for the people to stay committed to freedom while their circumstances necessary to obtain their freedom are worked out. Once this is accomplished, the southern states would be in a position to demand reparations. Each southern plebiscite calling for a constitutional amendment acknowledging the states' rights of nullification secession will send shockwaves through the federal empire. Each vote, win or lose, will send the message that the South's sons and daughters are yours no longer. The South will no longer sit submissively on the stools of everlasting repentance. Each vote will encourage another state to take up the effort. It will announce to the people of the South and the world that the people of Dixie have awoken from their self-imposed hibernation. And he goes on, they'll have a program of secession, or they'll somehow extract from the federal government not only reparations, but some type of autonomous relationship from the federal government, if not actually succeeding to form another nation. Secession might seem to be a very fanciful thing. It might seem to be very unreal as a possibility, vaporous speculation or hope. But consider this. In 2016, at the Texas State Republican Convention in Dallas, Texas, they had an element proposed for the platform which would call for a secession question on the primary ballot. Vote against it is 16 to 14. That's the Republican primary ballot. The vote was only 16 to 14. You would think a party that claimed to be patriotic, the vote would be 31 to 0 to any type of suggestion that the United States ought to be broken up. We're talking about the destruction of the nation. But it was 16 to 14. There were 31 members, 1 abstained, 14 were for it, 16 were against it. Probably the reason that it was defeated, or one of the possible reasons it was defeated, was that U.S. Texas Senator Ted Cruz was running in the presidential primaries. It would hardly do for a presidential candidate for the political party of his state to be for, or even admit to, possibly wanting to break up the United States. It would sort of discredit his candidacy. In one of the polls in 2016, 60% of Trump supporters said they would support secession if Hillary Clinton was elected. That's a pretty big percentage. However, since Trump was elected, the secession movements in this country, in particular the secession movement in Texas, which I monitor, has pretty much become moribund. They're deflated because the potential base for a secession movement is also the potential base to support Donald Trump. And to be supporting secession in a nation where Donald Trump is president is to be against Donald Trump. So at this moment, they're sort of treading water. They're sort of just biding their time. Trump's not re-elected in 2020, or a candidate like Trump is not elected in 2020 or 2024, I think that secession will come back to life. It is a movement based on alienation from modern American life, and there's a tremendous amount of political polarization. Political polls show surprising percentages of Americans supporting secession. So 2020, if Trump's not reelected, the situation could be very dramatically different. Secession movements could take off, and we'll be facing some real problems. And there's a review of the book in here. This is the Confederate Veterans, September, October 2017. And it's books and print section. They have that in most of the issues, maybe all the issues. And there's a picture of the book. The review is by Brett Moffat. And they introduced the review as saying the Kennedy brothers need no introduction to anyone who has worked in the Southern Heritage movement for very long. Since the Southwest Right was published some 25 years ago, they have written numerous books, traveled thousands of miles promoting the true history of the South. So again, the reviewer knows, and the general, people are a member of the neo-Confederate movement, they know who these people are. They're the people who wrote the Southwest Right. It's no mystery who they are. And they like this book. They say, it should come as no surprise. They are back with yet another book destined to be a classic. So they see this book as just like the first book. They see it as, at the same level. And Punished with Poverty does what all good history does. It tells a story. And so it's good history, Punished with Poverty. And they talk about, anyways, they go through the whole thing and they agree with all the conclusions. And they conclude the review with this. The Kennedys are not content with the recitation of the facts of history, but issue a call to action for those who seek a return to a constitutional limited republic of republics enforced by real states' rights. The founders would be proud. So they really recommend this book. Now, I actually don't see them mentioning slavery reparations of any type in this review. That's sort of something about the neo-Confederate movement is they're conscious of what might really sort of bring them down, what might really get the public to take a very critical look. So there's a lot of angry things in here. The South has never recovered economically from the second-class status it has suffered as a separate and captive nation within the Northern Empire. The maps, charts, and pictures enhance the text and illustrate vividly the poverty which the federal empire's policies have punished the South. The fact that this was deliberate, calculated, and vengeful is shown in the words of the criminals who forced these policies on a captive minority. So one thing it tells you, or what you learn from here, is this is an angry movement. This is a movement which sees the South as being really victimized by the Civil War. But on the other hand, you won't find the discussion of slavery reparations here. You get the book, you'll come across it. There's 2 chapters which will lead you to the topic, but you're not going to see it here. So sometimes if I was just a journalist picking up this, I wouldn't really be aware that there's a book out there advocating reparations for the slaveholders who lost their slaves because of emancipation. But they do praise the book. They say it would make the founders proud. So they're encouraging the readership of this magazine, and the readership of this magazine is their members, to go out and buy this book. This is the Kennedy book on myths of Southern slavery. It's a book which is basically supportive of slavery, or it says, Confederates, if you ask them, they always will say, we're not asking for revival of slavery. And so people sometimes misinterpret that as that they're not pro-slavery, or neo-Confederates are not sympathetic to slavery or don't justify aspects of it. Yes, I might not want to have a second piece of chocolate cake because I've already had one piece of chocolate cake. Doesn't necessarily mean because I don't want a second piece of chocolate cake. I don't like chocolate cake. In this case, they aren't advocating a revival of slavery. That's true. But that's because it's a matter of policy, not necessarily because of any strong condemnation of slavery. So in this book, there's a whole chapter called Chapter 3. It's called Abolitionism versus Christianity. And we read a section from the introduction. As has been shown with the onset of the radical abolitionist movement, slavery was redefined as one of the most hideous and hateful sins known to mankind. Those associated with slaveholding were held up to the nation and to the world as a personification of evil. Well, I don't know about you. I think slavery is sort of evil. But that's how they define radical abolitionism, is people who really think slavery is horrible. And the Southern Baptists passed a resolution back in 1995. They passed a resolution apologizing for slavery and the fact that the Southern Baptists had been pro-slavery in their beginning. And so he has this whole section of the radical influence on the Southern Baptist Convention. It's a scathing denunciation. We read parts of this. Passing of the so-called racial reconciliation resolution by the assembled delegates defamed and otherwise slandered the good names of Southern Baptists the past 150 years. The resolution is nothing more than liberal doublespeak for an act of cultural genocide against the South. And then later on they say, the infamous Baptist resolution makes no less than 4 errors. And they list a series of errors they see. So they see the resolution causing problems with race relations. Let me read this section. For every action, there's a counter-reaction. When Southern Baptists admit to the guilt of racism and slavery, the intended result is, of course, better race relations. But in politics, what one seeks is not always what one gets. Rather than increasing goodwill, black militants and their liberal allies are now using the guilt of slavery and racism resolution to demand more minority set-asides, affirmative action, and reparations. Yes, now at last we have the likes of Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, and Reverend Louis Farrakhan, all in the same political bed with Southern Baptist ministers. And they put quotes around Rev for each of these religious figures. And just to give you an idea of what type of reasoning makes up this book, I'm going to read you another section. Yes, I'm reading a lot of sections. You can skip it, maybe go to some papers we have online. But I think you miss out how screwy a lot of their thinking is. And you can quote parts of it, but you really don't get the visceral feel. So he has a section towards the conclusion of abolitionism versus Christianity. He says, myth, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, makes holding a person in slavery sinful. I tend to believe that. But they explain, reality, if the golden rule is enforceable upon the master of a slave, it's also enforceable upon a slave. Therefore, according to the golden rule, the slave must view his master's betterment before his own. How can taking away a valuable asset, slave property, better his master? If both master and slave live by the golden rule, all the evils of pagan slavery are destroyed. So if they live by the golden rule, I guess slavery is okay, if you're a slave. So let's not stop it. Let's continue reading. If both masters, okay. But even more benefits can result if the golden rule is correctly followed. The goodwill established by these two men while following the golden rule makes it possible for the slave to gain his freedom. That was the plea of the early American emancipation, a plea that was given a death blow by radical abolitionism. Those horrible radical abolitionists, they have this idea that maybe you just deserve to be freed if you're a slave. So that goes in part of it. Um, so what do they think about reparations? From the time of the elimination of slavery to the present, African Americans have lived and worked in a nation that once only knew them as slaves. It's from this background of hardship and discrimination that many liberals now contend that reparations are owed to the descendants of slaves. Yet there is evidence that the descendants of American slave population have suffered. You ask the question, yet is there evidence that the descendants of American slave populations have suffered irreparable harm because of the experience of their ancestors? What would the lifestyle of the average African American be like if his ancestors had not been taken out of Africa? How does the lifestyle of the average sub-Saharan African compared with the lifestyle of African American living in Mississippi, one of the poorest states in the Union? By answering these questions, we will have a better understanding of the condition of life for all Africans and be able to more correctly determine whether irreparable harm has been done to the descendants of American slave population. So they actually have a whole section here, right here, and it's about the average income, life expectancy, literacy rates for all Africans in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, there's no consideration that they're victims also, that maybe colonialism and the slave trade before the Europeans colonized Africa maybe tore the hell out of Africa, and that's why it is today. That this whole centuries of basically buying slaves on the coast, which would fund a variety of armed groups going through the South to buy up slaves, go through Africa to buy up slaves, and ripping the shreds out of the societies there, might be a factor why Africa is where it is, or the fact that then the Europeans came in and engaged in colonial oppression and took away and took over the governance and eliminated traditions of self-government in Africa. So the victim is blamed for his own victimization here. And they quote, they find, always looking for an African American to endorse their viewpoint. In his book, Out of America, A Black Man Confronts Africa, Keith B. Richburg gives a graphic account of his tour of that continent as a correspondent for the Washington Post. After witnessing the depth of misery that was a daily reality in Africa, after seeing for himself Africans killing and mutilating other Africans, after learning this was Africa, the Africa that by the grace of God and a slave ship he had escaped, Richburg thanked God that his ancestors had made it out of Africa and had thus given him the title of American. Now, is an African American who was a correspondent for the Washington Post. Yes, Washington Post. But anyways, that's what they look for. Now I found a black person. He's endorsed my viewpoint. So I guess it's okay. Here's another summary comment. The legacy of slavery in America has presented African Americans with a lifestyle and an opportunity for material advancement. It makes them the envy of every non-African American in the world. How African Americans of today can justify demanding reparations for slavery is beyond the comprehension of anyone with an ounce of common sense. I guess I must not have an ounce of common sense. I guess that's where me and the neo-Confederates would tend to agree. And so they found another African American to endorse it. There's a bunch of other really crazed things. African Americans are sort of run down here. But that's their book. And so this book was published in, let me see, I think I have 3 or 4 copies, 2003. It's been out there for a while. And their views of reparation were long, they go back to 2003. They're hardly a mystery to the membership or of the neo-Confederate movement, and probably a great many members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans have bought this book and are aware of it. So this book is sold, was sold first to Confederate Veteran in 2004, the January-February issue, and it's being sold, excuse me a second, they sell books in the Confederate Veteran, Confederate gifts from international headquarters, and that's the international headquarters of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And here's an ad for the myths of American slavery. And let's see what this says. Myths of American slavery. From the commonly held misconceptions about the history of slavery to the acknowledgement that slavery has been used by races all around the world, Myths of American Slavery provides an important and iconoclastic coverage which surveys social, political, and even religious interactions with slavery issues. A fascinating, eye-opening book from one of the authors of The South Was Right. Again, they want you to know that this is the same guy who wrote The South Was Right. It's sort of seen as a book which is pretty much universally respected by the neo-Confederate movement, where they see it as a positive thing to be mentioned. There's probably maybe a neo-Confederate or two that doesn't like the book. And if you read this blurb for it, it doesn't really tell you what's it about. You know it's the Sons of Confederate Veterans, so you're sort of guessing that what iconoclastic might mean. But they don't always put neo-Confederate ideology on the surface. You don't always, in fact, rarely will you find it straight up on the surface in your face. You'd have to buy the book and then know what it says. But they're selling it starting in 2004. This is the Southern Mercury. This is a publication put out by the Sons of Confederate Veteran Educational Pack. It's not generally known. It's sort of an in-house publication. It wasn't on newsstands. It really wasn't sold. It wasn't in libraries. When they sold it in ads in the Confederate Veteran, really just said it was unreconstructed, but it really didn't give a lot of information about it. Wasn't a lot of online information about what the contents are. Since it was in-house and it wasn't sort of available to the general public, the people who write for this publication are pretty frank in their views. It's pretty much out there. It's pretty much in your face. It's really pretty much a hair-raising publication. At some point, I'm going to do a whole video on this publication. I think it really represents what the Sons of Confederate Veterans is all about. But right now, we'll just talk about this issue, which is Volume 1, Number 3, November, December 2003. This came out pretty much before they started selling the book. And so here's a review, Myths of American Slavery. The review is by Ann Rives Zappa. Let me read the introduction. Walter Donald Kennedy is perhaps best known for The South Was Right, co-authored with his twin brother, Ron Kennedy. Walter has followed this Southern primer with an impelling book. That's this book. Every Southerner wishing to defend our beloved Southland against lying Yankee historians must read this well-researched and even-handed book categorizing American slavery. Kennedy uses truth to expose myths, blaming the South for slavery, and to focus the spotlight of guilt on unscrupulous Northern politicians led by fanatical hate and armed by all uncharitableness who have perpetrated these pernicious lies. So it's a book that every Southerner should do it. And the conclusion repeats that. Walter Kennedy's Myths of American Slavery, it's right here, is required reading for all Southerners. And it's pretty angry. It explains, Black militants use Christian and Southern admissions of guilt for racism and slavery to foster hatred for Southerners and our principles. Organizations such as the NAACP use these misguided apologies as the basis to demand more affirmative action and insist that the Congress pay reparations. Kennedy calls this demand literally blackmail. It's a little joke he makes in his book. The request for slavery reparations is blackmail. So, they started promoting this book to the membership a while back. And it's pretty much been for sale. Again, we showed this earlier in their catalog, but also it's been for sale in most of their catalogs from the past. Going back to 2004, they have it in their catalog, the book. Here, let me just pull it up real quick. Myths of American Slavery. So, and they've been pretty much have sold it all the way up in the catalog every year up to 2016, 2017. Since then, it seems to have dropped out. The latest catalog is pretty sanitized. But Sons of Confederate Veterans has been selling their Myths of American Slavery, which condemns the Southern Baptist resolution about slavery, which condemns requests for slavery reparations, and which is a justification or an excuse for slavery as it existed in the South. So, and the authors of this book, or the author, Walter Donald Kennedy is author of Myths of American Slavery. But both of them are the authors of Punished with Poverty. They're the people who are defending Confederate heritage. They're the people currently in charge of Confederate heritage defense. And it's not like the Sons of Confederate Veterans didn't know who these people are. It's not like Mr. Gramling Jr. didn't know who these people were. They know exactly who they are, and they know exactly what they stand for. Now, before the public, they're still going to be saying, oh, the South, oh, the past, oh, our ancestors, oh, they're brave. They're going to be saying all this stuff. But this is the reality of Confederate heritage. This is what really they're defending. The next episode is going to be about the neo-Confederate idea of the Civil War as a holy war. And again, look in the description for some links, and then attached to this video will be a short video about general resources that you can go to find out more about the neo-Confederate movement. Thank you for your time.
Resources to fight Neo-Confederacy and be engaged in the fight against Neo-Confederacy. There are links to online resources to fight Neo-Confederacy, and there's a Facebook group to get engaged and be connected to others fighting Neo-Confederacy. All the links shown in this video are in the description of the video below. We have a Facebook page, Deracialize the Landscape. In the green band, you can see the URL to the Facebook group. You probably can also find it by searching for it on Facebook. This page is a general purpose page regarding all issues of white supremacy on the built landscape. This will include items related to fighting Neo-Confederacy such as news items, links to other resources, investigative reporting, and events. You can participate and contribute items that fit the purpose of this Facebook page. We have a Twitter account, Anti-Neo-Confederate. You can see the URL in the green band. News updates, links to resources and information, and notices of upcoming events will be posted on this account. In the green band, you see the link to the website neo-confederatereader.com. This website has a tremendous amount of information that couldn't fit into the book, The Confederate and Neo-Confederate Reader. This is a book that shows two things. The site shows in the Confederates and slaveholders own words what the Confederacy was about, which was about preserving slavery and white supremacy. This site shows in the neo-Confederates' own words what Confederate heritage is about, which has been and is about preserving white supremacy and an extended set of prejudices. When some neo-Confederate is going on and on with some farrago of nonsense about the Confederacy, you can point out what the Confederate leaders actually said, what the Confederacy was about. When some neo-Confederate is going on and on about quote-unquote heritage, you can quote what the leading neo-Confederates said what the so-called heritage is about. In both cases, they themselves will not stop going on, but everyone else will know them as the fools they are. At this website, at the above link, you'll find on the web page many links to articles that you can read to learn more about the neo-Confederate movement. There are articles from peer-reviewed academic journals which you can read online. There's a series of articles that were published in the online publication Black Commentator. There are links to books about the neo-Confederate movement. There are links to news articles about the neo-Confederate movement. At the website templeofdemocracy.com, there are other informative articles about neo-Confederacy. For example, there is this page about the Sons of Confederate Veterans and neo-Confederate ideas about slavery, the Civil War, and slave reparations. I recommend sitting down before you read it. For another example, at this page you can learn about the neo-Confederate Celtic identity theories. As time goes on, more pages with information will be added. There is the Anti-Neo-Confederate blog. This blog tracks the neo-Confederates, the racialized landscape, and secession movements. It reports on the campaigns against neo-Confederacy and covers issues about fighting the neo-Confederate movement. You can sign up to get emails of each posting. Additionally, links to resources are provided. There are short news items and commentaries about developments. All the links shown in this video are in the description of the video below. Inform others. If you find any of these resources useful, we ask that you let others know on social media. The more people are informed about what the neo-Confederate movement is about, the less the neo-Confederates can advance their agenda. Remember to like this video, subscribe to the Anti-Neo-Confederate channel, and share. Please share this channel. The neo-Confederate movement is not going to stop itself.